All right. Thank you for being here today. Writer Vivien Sieber, and your most recent thing you've written, I think, is the book about the Holocaust. I would call that nonfiction, and it's called Kino and Kinder. I may have pronounced it incorrect, but we'll get to the bottom of that. All right. Thank you for being here. Was that the first thing you've written?
It's the first book I've written. I should explain that I'm actually a biologist, so I've written quite a lot of scientific papers that have been peer reviewed. Then I moved into teaching development and information literacy and e-learning, and I wrote chapters and monographs again that they were generally reviewed. So I've published quite a lot, but this was certainly my first book.
What how was the process different for this versus a regular, like a research paper?
It was quite different in many ways, in that I wrote it and sort of, having not written anything like this before, I started writing almost from a table of, I built a table of events and then started writing and what I did, because as a scientist, you don't tend to write very much. And a friend looked at it and said, no, you can't just say this happened, this happened, this happened. You need to explain why and what the people were like. So instead of being written as, when you write a scientific paper, you tend to start with the methods, like this is what I did. And then you move to the results and saying, this is what I found. And then you try and explain them in the context of other people's work. And then I tended to write my introductions last. So this is what I found, and this is why I've done it. That this is what everybody found before me. Now, with the book, I'd got this sort of timeline and this very sort of sketchy chapters. And it was very much, as more information came in, I could like put that in. And then, of course, I was adding much more color. So that was a friend who helped me edit it to the stage that you could send it to a publisher who might consider it. And the publishers then gave me the lovely editor, Mark Cripps. And he said, no, you can't have 122 footnotes. And no, you can't have a chapter that's 50 pages long. So he incorporated the footnotes into the text, or helped me to do it. So, and then he divided, he said the structure was all right because it follows the chronology, but the chapters needed breaking up much more, which he did rather brilliantly. And so, yes, that's very different from writing a paper.
When you were writing it, when was the first time someone else looked at what you were writing, like in your process or through your drafts?
Oh, actually, probably quite soon, 3 or 6 months. But then it was only, I actually had two friends who helped. One who checked the very basic grammar and spelling, and the second who did the much more editorial of checking that it made sense and that the English was good, as opposed to you'd have got the commas in the right place. So yeah, that was very quick. But they had it chapters as they were written, and they had certainly my good friend who did the main editing had some chapters several times.
Okay,
it was quite iterative.
The footnotes part is probably from more of the scientific writing. You have a lot more footnotes. Is that correct?
Well, it was really interesting when I asked my academic friends. All the arts and humanities people said footnotes, disgusting. You can't possibly have those. And all the scientists said, yeah, you just read them when you want them. And so there's obviously a discipline difference in there. I mean, I'm used to. I mean, I read the footnotes if I'm reading big novels. I'll read the footnotes, or if I look some up if they look interesting. But I'm just ignoring them.
I've read Moby Dick, and a lot of Shakespeare has those books with the footnotes in there. And I try to read the text as it is and understand it. And then you go in and look at the references or definitions of things or explanations in the footnotes. And I find it slows down the reading a lot. So I end up like with those books, I would read a page, look at the footnotes, read it again, look up anything I needed to look up, and then if it was in the middle of a chapter, I would try to do that for every page and then go back and read the chapter again. So it takes a lot longer to read those, but I think you're understanding it better. True, sometimes those footnotes just describe, or something you look up just describes a like a little thing that made sense at the time, like a some sort of reference to someone famous at the time or whatever that maybe is lost to the modern day reader of it. But at least it was kind of like maybe not like a treasure hunt, but maybe kind of like that, where you have to sit down and actually it's more than just reading. You're working different parts of your mind, and then you have to go back and read it again and listen to the way the writer wrote it, as far as if you want the tone, the flow, and the lyricism of the work, especially with Shakespeare. I find that, and a little bit with Melville, and I'm sure there's other people, but
I don't. Wait, there's something like Thackeray. When I read Vanity Fair, which I've read multiple times with in different editions, that I don't go. I read it and then I'll look up a footnote and then I'll carry on. I won't reread the chapter like you're doing so carefully. But I've discovered all sorts of things that I could not possibly have known, that they tend to be the jokes.
yeah.
And so and so and so and so. Well, they're solicitors in the book, but they're a recent, famous crime.
Mm.
So yes, I think I'd miss out if I didn't read them. Now, my footnotes were a bit different, because I was trying to either reference something, as you might academically, or explain something that I didn't think people might necessarily know. And of course, by putting that in the text, you've gained that you know what it is and you're not distracted.
How much of a chore was that, going back and putting in the footnotes, working it into the story?
Well, it wasn't a huge trial for me because my editor did it.
Oh.
I don't think it was. I mean, I don't think it was too bad. I did some, and basically, if you take the example of the Trabie, which was a Trabant, which was a car produced in the Soviet states that was always
Okay.
breaking down, and known as a Trabie. Now, that was a very brief. That just turns into one sentence, saying, this unreliable car produced in the Soviet era is always breaking down along, on the sidewalk.
How did you determine, when you were writing this, how did you determine the point of view to write it in?
Sorry, do you have the point of view of telling the story?
Yes.
Well, I tried to say what I thought had happened. I mean, it started by accident. It was very much a detective story. In that, I'd always known my father and grandmother were refugees from Vienna, and that they had left in 1938. And then my grandmother had ended up being a matron in a hostel for girls saved on the Kinder transport. But when my dad died, I'd acquired a file of, he basically did a survey of the Kinder, actually obvious as old ladies, asking them what they'd done with their lives, where they were, what qualifications they'd got. And they'd written incredibly movingly about the experience of anti-Semitism at school, leaving their families as young children, adjusting to life in a hostel other than a family. And what they did, they also had their contact details, and some were still alive. So I had that. I had my dad's unpublished manuscripts, and I had some correspondence I found completely by accident mostly between him and his mother, my grandmother, but a little contemporary journal he kept because he was interned. He was sent. It was just when the war went badly. males between 16 and 60 were basically collected, sent to the Isle of Man, and in his case, he was sent to Canada and back again. And he kept a daily journal, which I found. So and there was a big box of photographs. What I tried to do was be faithful to all these different stories. And there are large tracts which were written by my dad, not by me. It's a different font. And again, there's lots of quotes from the Kinder, again in a different font. Oh, that was something that my editor threw his hands up in horror at, because I think I was using 12 different styles when I submitted it. And he went, no, we can't do that. And we settled down to 3.
Okay.
So all the Kinder are in one font. My dad's in another font, and I'm in their standard font. So I basically, then I sort of realized that historic things that happened historically were important to the story. So my dad described watching Hitler marching into Vienna at the Anschluss and the troops, which he happened to watch because my grandmother's flat overlooked the Ringstrasse. So I got that description, but if you just put that in, nobody will know what you're talking about. So then I had to explain that the very briefly, I tried to be brief, the history of the Nazis marching it, that Germany and Austria shouldn't ever be joined, and that was just ignored, and they marched across the border. So I put in odd bits of, if you like, what I hope is historical context. And of course, the structure was easy because I just followed the timeline.
Did you use a timeline, like a picture somewhere, to keep it straight when you were writing it, or how did you?
I had a table in Word, which I could add to as I went along. So actually, my sister started it. It's a table of what documents we got doing and what was happening and when. And so as I got more interested and I got more evidence, I could add to the table.
Is that something you can look at all at once, or is it a thing you have to scroll through?
It's Word, you scroll, but it's not.
Scroll.
That's not really a problem.
Okay. That was one of the things I found when I was teaching, that I would start before every class. I would write a timeline on the board of, a couple years before, a couple years after, whatever we were talking about. And if we had talked about something before then, my topic was mainly law enforcement history. So I'd have it over 100-year timeline up there. And then every class I would add to the timeline what we were talking about in that class. And it really,
that's a good idea.
Really brings into context to see it all at once, to be able to say, oh, this is first, when you start a timeline, if you put wars in it, that's your basic timeline. You put all these wars between different places, and there's always so many wars going on everywhere, wars, conflict, whatever you want to call them. And then you put in that, whatever topic you're discussing, and then you can put in some popular stories from the time that may still be known now, like Prohibition, when that started, when that was over, when certain people get arrested, or the big headlines. And it really, I wish I'd have started that back when I was in school myself and just kept a timeline going. I mean, you could do Magna Carta and before, all up to the future. And
that's a really good idea, because when I used to teach genetics, and I'd always try and say, Mendel, everybody knows about him being a monk. And I would try and say when and where. In fact, it's Brno, where my grandmother was born. And I was really upset when a student actually put in their exam paper that Mendel was born in the town Viv's grandmother was born, having completely missed the points. And then I remember lecturing, saying something about the First World War, and there were like 50 blank faces. And these are biology students, and I was shocked that they didn't know what the First or Second World War were.
Mm.
Even when I
Yes.
put the dates in, it meant nothing.
Wow.
Yeah, so timeline would have been a really good idea, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, rather
It's
than the bullet points of what I'm talking about today.
I could even see using it over the years in just primary school of saying we learned about this in first or second grade, and then in third grade you're just adding to that same big picture timeline. But for me it helps to be able to look at it all at once. I keep a lot of notes on the computer, and the scrolling back and forth is fine. It's easy to update it and you can go back and look at it, but having it in one thing where you can see it all at once, it's truly, to me, that feeling of when somebody says you can't deal with something because you're too close to the picture and you have to back up to get the perspective. I think that's getting that perspective of history or any subject, is just looking at it all at once.
One of the first things I did was I realized I had loads of relatives I didn't know I had, or know who they who they were. So I constructed a family tree.
Mm.
And yes, you're quite right. The only way I could end up sorting this out was I think I initially used Genie, which was free then. But the only way I could sort out what was going on was to print the whole thing out and stick the pages together. And it
Hmm.
took the whole dining table to scroll across it just to get an idea of my grandmother's family came from Brno. But before that, it's a really big family. That they were all in some form of textile or draping. But the Tikus were a huge family. And I was only really interested in a very small branch of it, but it's still useful to know how it sticks together.
Yeah.
And I discovered a great aunt I didn't know I had.
Mm. Wow. Yeah, I like those family tree things. I think that's a good way to also, if you're going to visualize that, not just for the words of people up there where you can see the family tree and who's who, and then maybe if you put pictures in there. I think Harry Potter in the movies had a room where it had a family tree on the wall with a bunch of different pictures on there. I hadn't seen anything like that before, but I could also see the artistic mind taking over, and then you put it on the wall or you project it onto a wall or even a smaller picture, I guess, and you just paint a tree over it. And then you can always explain that to people. Well, this is the family tree, and it just looks like the painting of a tree, but you can trace, like, this is this side of the family. These are these people. These are these people. These are these people. And yeah, I like that for the crossing over from the writing mind in words to the visual artistic mind. It's
Well,
interesting.
actually, family trees is a thing geneticists do all the time.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Oh, certainly medical geneticists do. I mean, there are lots of useful conventions. So that was not an artistic thing. That was sort of just a natural thing. And
Hmm.
you can get some of the softwares will let you draw your tree as a tree if you want to.
Okay.
Um, I ended up spending a lot of time looking for a tree that wasn't looking like a tree. I just wanted straight lines.
Hmm. Okay. That's the biologist in you, I think, maybe.
I possibly. I mean, it worked for me. I can
Hmm.
see that a trick. You can do amazing things with some of these online things where you put pictures and all sorts of things up. I probably I probably now have too much evidence for it to make sense online. For some people, I've got a lot of evidence, and it would be too cluttered for me to see. I can't see something when it gets really complicated.
Hmm. Yeah, you got to make that. You got to be able to zoom in on it. I think that's why it helps to see like the total mass of it as much as you can see, and then you just zoom in, zoom in, zoom in, and you see the finer details of it. Hmm. How did you figure out or decide which pictures or illustrations to use in your book?
Well, some of them are amazing because they're historical ones of my grandmother rather liked dressing up. Um, with the ones of the Kinder as youngish girls, I didn't have that many, so I used nearly all of them. Um, generally the ones that were sort of relevant to the story or illustrated something. So there are some modern ones that I've taken in Vienna, or some less modern ones that I took in the 80s. And one I've used the same place, sort of from the 80s and in 2019 or 2015 to show the difference.
Oh, okay. When you were collecting all the journals and manuscripts, what was your process for that? Was it just people you knew, or did you have to go research other places, or did you find other things and
I had
places?
an enormous amount of help. Now, the Vienna archives were amazing. They sent packets of papers free, which wouldn't have happened in England. So I had a very rich source from them. And then, we were in Vienna in 2019, and I got an introduction to the conservators of the Josefstadt Jewish database, Helen and Heinz Rupertsberger. And I emailed them and asked what I thought was an easy question, which is, how can I find out what happened to the cinema after the war? Because my grandmother had a cinema. And I was hoping they would say, well, you go to this archive or you do that. But 2 weeks later, I got this totally courteous email in English with a timeline attached and a note that Helen had photographed 120 documents that were sitting in Dropbox for me.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah. So they'd been to the archive and more or less done all the work for me. They worked out what had happened. As far as we could never solve the problem, that we could never solve it entirely, but they found out an enormous amount. And then, of course, I had papers from from the state and city archive that told other bits of that story.
I wonder why. I wonder if they do that because they are trying to not make up for what happened, but to not appear like they're covering anything up, for just to say we're fully cooperating with people who want to research this thing and we're going to help as much as we can.
I think Vienna in particular has realized that they now very much acknowledge the terrible things that were done. And yes, they're not charging because they want to help. They've gone further because they after the book came out, they invited me as part of the Jewish Welcome Service, and we had a lovely week in Vienna being shown around. Obviously much more Jewish things. And they've offered citizenship to the descendants of victims of National Socialism. Now they've changed their rules for descendants of victims of National Socialism. You can have dual nationality, whereas anybody else wanting Austrian nationality has to give up their primary one.
Right.
So they are very clear. During our visit, there were receptions with really important people saying that we're really sorry, we want to make up for it. And there are a couple of amazing, if you like, monuments. One is the Holocaust Memorial Wall, which is just a circle of slabs of granite with the names of the people who were killed, which is very, very moving. And then they've turned the railway station, which was used to deport people to camps, into like an outdoor museum, which again is, very, very moving. And it's got railway lines and like concrete trains that people have graffitied. So they are trying very hard indeed.
When you were putting all this together, did you have an ideal reader in mind for the book, or were you telling it like you were telling it to yourself or to your kids or to your dad, or what was the audience that you had in your mind when you were writing it?
I'm not sure that I had an audience in mind. but now I give lots of talks, and I'm invited to give talks. Some to schools and things like that. Others to, because of the One Life film, people want to hear about the hostel girls because some of them came from Czechoslovakia. I didn't write it with the intention of, oh, this is a Holocaust book, though I mean, obviously it is. The reason my father did things was he actually wrote a report on, he wanted the family that ran the families that organised the hostel to be acknowledged, because it was entirely voluntary. So he'd ended up living with one of the families and in some ways never moved out. But he wanted their contributions acknowledged, because everybody writes about the Kinder, extraordinary as they are, but very few write about the people who cared for the Kinder. So there was, in a way, it was, I wanted to publish the book that my dad hadn't published, but obviously I had to make it mine.
What was your experience or route to publication?
Slightly frustrating, but okay. We had odd problems with templates and things like that. This is where I need to acknowledge my husband, Paul Hodges, who was wonderful. And he's an IT techie. And so he was totally patient. And, when I messed up the template, he put it right. And he helped with the photographs and some of the digitizing, things like that. I did the index and referencing, which I didn't find difficult. I think possibly one of the big things is that because I'd got this background of encouraging other people to use technology, I'm pretty good with Word. And so I used a lot of the Word features, and something I would definitely encourage is that you start using Word for long documents. So I did that right from the outset, which meant going back and putting things in was very easy because it was all styled, and I can jump around the manuscript. I didn't actually put it all together as a manuscript till very late. I knew that once you've got pictures in it, that word length, it's going to slow any computer down. So I did it chapter by chapter at first. The frustration was, I suppose, that I was much better at Word than my editor. And so I think he's a lot better at Word now.
Nice. Then was there anything else that you found your professional work experience helped in writing this, like structuring the index or any other things like that you think a person that wasn't a biologist that did research and wrote scientific papers would have had issues with?
It's not the biologist in this. It's a sort of, I've been lucky enough to work with a lot of librarians and do information literacy. So there, I'd learned a lot from them. So my searching skills are quite good. And I'm not a librarian, but they are far more meticulous than I am. But I used a reference manager. I happen to like EndNote. It's quite old-fashioned, but I've used it for so long it didn't seem worth learning a new one. So it's things like that which aren't a biologist, but they are these sort of information literacy working in universities.
When did you decide to write a book like this?
Roughly while I was doing it. I didn't say, oh, I'm going to write a book. I don't think. And the like this it's how it turned out.
So were you just looking through the journals and your father's manuscripts, just curiosity for yourself, or when did it switch over to, I think this needs to be a book?
That's quite a difficult question in some ways, because in some ways, yes, I often thought I would do something with my dad's stuff, but while I had a day job, I didn't, because I had a demanding day job. But we also, if you remember, had a lockdown, and so I had lots of time. And once I started, it was actually quite quick. The writing time was not huge. The much more piddling around, sorting out, and editing time was much bigger.
I like the idea of having the different contributors and different fonts. I've struggled for a while thinking about how to do assignment or tags of who's saying what in books, mainly fiction, so not nonfiction, but fiction. And I thought about doing different fonts for that. And how did you choose which fonts you were going to use for which person? Was it the personality of the person in the font, or how much thought did you put into that?
Oh, no, I did give a little thought to that, but
Okay.
then the editors, yes, said other things. What I did was I set up word styles for them. And so when I was doing my dad, I used a style I knew he liked, which happens to be
Nice.
Century School book. The editor was completely right that it was so confusing and really very difficult to handle when you've got a different style for each of the girls. So we just chose a fairly straightforward style, and the base style was the publishers anyway.
Okay. Yeah, it'd be tough when you're reading that, switching back and forth from typeset to typeset.
Well,
But
it's all. I mean, the whole thing was done in Word, um, and then I think they Kindle is a PDF, or they print from PDF and the Kindle is Word. So the whole thing's done in Word right till the end. I sent it off in Word, and then they do their magic.
okay.
And
Is the publishing company its own separate thing, or is it a publishing company you'd used before?
no, it's its own separate thing, because
Okay.
obviously the sort of academic publishers that I was used to wouldn't do a book like that. I did talk to one academic publisher who said yes, but sadly is now out of business. I mean, I did want a review. I did want some sort of review. I didn't want to self-publish as such.
Did you send it out to many people before you sent it to the final print, or just to
Uh,
get some insight from people?
do you mean reviewing it, or trying to find a publisher?
Well, after you had the manuscript done and almost ready to publish, and
No,
did you have anybody else look at it?
uh,
No?
well, only the friends who'd helped me all the way through, and my husband. So no, I didn't send it to lots of people to for their comments. But once it got published, I, you know, readers and friends sent me corrections, which was really helpful. And because they're very small print runs, it was very easy to put the corrections in. And it's very easy to correct Kindle. So yes, it's now had quite a lot of people reading it, and it's so much better for it. And I'm very grateful to the people who did tell me. I mean, nearly all sent me very nice messages saying, "Oh, do you realise?" And I'm very grateful to them.
I like the nearly all. The the marketing for it, how did you approach the marketing?
The marketing was very disappointing. The marketing from the publishers was very disappointing. It's an hour's chat with Melanie, and they put it out on their website and stuff. I put up a website, viviensieber.eu, and I used sort of social media a bit, and doing things like this podcast. It's some. I mean, it's been wonderful when people have invited me to talk or something like that, because then I can pop it out on LinkedIn and things like that.
Okay. Yeah. I've seen the Instagram page for it. I know there's a Facebook group and then the Pinterest, as well as your website that you just mentioned. And all of that will be in the show notes if people want to look at those links. I don't,
What's really
if,
nice is the Facebook group is. I mean, it may be very small, but it is growing. And one thing that's really lovely is that the daughter of one of the Kinder who died, but the daughter contacted me through Instagram, and we haven't yet met, but we've spoken, and so that's really really nice. And the BBC Newcastle picked up the story, and they've done a series of podcasts called Just the Girls. So if you just go to BBC Sounds and search for the girls,
okay.
that gives you the story of one of the hostels, the Tynemouth one, but it's got Inga, who is 19, living in Wimbledon, and she was the youngest of the girls. So it's got Inga on it, and it's got recordings of some of the other girls. Basically, they took me and some of the other daughters to the house, and we talked a bit about what it was like. Or I talked least, but what it must. It is so startling, because we were in this beautiful big house that's beautifully decorated and furnished with lovely fluffy carpets, and it's lovely and warm, and the hosts were really nice. And yet it wouldn't have been at all like that when the girls were there. And it overlooks the sea, so to us it's lovely. But imagine it being in a bombing zone, And I found descriptions from the girls of being carried out to the air raid shelter at night. So that was a really big contrast.
How many people are still alive now that have talked to
Oh,
you what you put in the book?
well, two that the one that I in some ways spoke to most, who let us record her, Elfie, sadly died in 19 or 20. As did Ruth. The ones that I'm in contact with, there are about two now. Inga, and who's in Wimbledon, and Dasha, who's in Czech, who was Czech, but she's in Australia. But we email rather than talk.
What were their impressions of it? Like, how did they take the book?
Oh, I did actually send the chapter about the hostel. Yes, I sent the chapters that were relevant to the girls. I did send that to Dasha before I got it published. And there were one or two things I didn't put in, and I asked her about it, and she agreed that I was probably right not putting them in. And she said it was fair. And then obviously I sent her a copy of the book, and she said that she was really, because she'd never, you arrive, you're maybe 10, and you don't speak English or German. In her case, she only spoke Czech. And so she can't talk to her peers, the children, and she can't really talk to the matrons. So the last thing she did was really ask about how the hostel was set up or funded, or what lives the matrons had had beforehand. She knew about the cinema, and the other matron was Alice Erbach, who was a very famous cook. So she knew that she was a famous cook and had written a book, but they didn't know any more. No, why would they? And I mean, Inga was very nice about it, and I think she thought it was fair. What I wanted her to do was think it was fair.
When you were writing this versus your technical writing, what are the big differences that you found between the two different types?
Adjectives, you don't really use them in science. So you know, I did this, it might have turned blue. Whereas you I had to learn that, because you can't just say, oh, so and so did this and so did that. So that was where my friend really helped, sort of, you know, no, you've got to put some more in there. So yeah, adjectives and longer sentences.
So report writing, kind of blending report writing and storytelling a little more.
Well, it becomes more storytelling, though
Mm.
it probably is short by a proper writer.
I mean, that's good. That's good. I think better to be more sparse, but I mean, everybody has their taste, but yeah. Hmm. Where do you think that, or where do you picture that that spirit for writing comes from? Where you have your
Oh,
technical writing side, and then your wanting to do this other one.
well, my father he learned English as a foreigner, because he was the only subject he did in Vienna. It's the only thing he did at school that he was interested in. Later, because he was hoping to see his half brother who lived in London, and so he learnt English as a foreigner, and he ended up working as a copywriter and then moving into advertising. And he respected English in a way that us natives don't. So I learnt a lot from him about writing. And then, of course, I learnt when I was doing my PhD that you write differently and shorter. Um, and then when I moved into learning development type things, I had to learn that your reports somewhat that they're longer and they're structured. Um, and there may be an element of selling in them. I mean, you're not going to bend the data, but you might want it to look a bit positive, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I'd already had to change how I wrote more than once. And so the book was just another change.
What do you have planned for the future?
Um, I'm not quite clear. I'm not quite sure what I have planned for the future in terms of writing. I am writing odd things for newspapers, um, magazines, and things, and I'm actually rather enjoying that, because they're not very long,
Okay.
but they are all about the book or something in that area.
Okay. So not the technical writing, more of the.
No, I'm not doing any technical writing. I haven't done. I've not been doing that for too long to do it sensibly. You know, science changes too quickly. I haven't done it for 20 or 30 years now.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, the IT and education stuff rather took over.
What's the best way for people to follow this book and work in the future? Then is that the website we've talked about?
Website, yes,
Okay. And
or,
that's the
or Instagram or something.
Vivien Sieber at dot EU.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. How much more marketing and publishing do you have planned on the horizon for this book?
Well, as much as I can carry on doing. Obviously, when I give talks, quite often people nicely buy books. Um, I'm very open to opportunities. So I've got quite a lot of talks planned sort of over the next year almost. And so there's that. And then there's whatever happens after you've written an article or something like that. So I think that's probably what I'm going to be doing.
Where do you do most of your writing?
Oh, here. I virtually only here. It's a desktop, and I just sit and do it. I may think about it rather different. I maybe think if it's a talk, I quite often think about it when I'm swimming or walking or something, but I do the actual writing on a keyboard rather than I don't really like laptops.
Do you keep like a notebook with you, or the note features in your phone, or some electronic device where you are taking notes when you're out thinking about things, or you have to get home and write those down?
Generally, I mean, I have a notebook by me by the computer. So obviously, if it's a phone call, then I'll do it from here mostly for preference. If it's while I'm out, I'll probably just use notes on the phone. But generally, I don't write that. You know, it's something. If it's something new that I'm likely to forget, then I'll write it down. But if it's just an idea that I've been playing with for some time, then I'll probably hope that I've remembered it, that I'll remember it,
Hmm.
or I'll have to thought again. Of course,
How do
sometimes you
you?
don't. That's irritating.
Yeah, that's why you write them down so you don't forget them. What How do you organize all those thoughts when you have all those notes that you've taken either in your notebook or on your phone or other places?
Uh, well, it would depend what they are. Um, I'll try and use them quickly once I've got notes. Otherwise, they'll just disappear. Um, and so I'll probably, in the case of when I was writing the book, I'd incorporate it as quickly as I could, which is why having styles and chapters was very useful. Um, I have to say, I don't think I'm very good at that. I think if I was doing it from scratch, I would, because I had all this mass of papers and letters and things that were completely unclassified. I mean, I had a sort of small suitcase full of completely unclassified letters
Hmm.
and no real training in what you do with history methodology. So I basically thought about it and I went, well, if this was a field, I'd take random samples till I got something that looked as though it was consistent. And so I did some very, very crude things, like I sorted them out by dates,
Mhm.
by who wrote them. And then I wrote little abstracts on the front, so I didn't have to keep going back to the same letter. And I stuck them in a ring binder so I could move them around. I'm really not sure that that was the best way of doing it. I think with hindsight, I'd probably spend longer finding a nice methodology and a way of recording things. So I ended up not having to do with so much paper stuff, but more stuff on the computer.
Hmm.
I did put lots of notes. I said when I started, yeah, I did put lots and lots of notes into EndNote. There's a way of on a reference, you can put free text. So when I got something, I would have the reference, and then I would have a little abstract of what the reference was about, and possibly even more important why I thought it was relevant, if that makes sense, or something that would mean easy for me to go and say yes, I can use that.
Yeah. I mean, all that makes sense to me as far as how to keep track of those ideas. I found that writing, if you write about something, it's basically trying to straighten out how you think about it. So going through all those processes makes sense because you're trying to absorb all the information and then put it in an order to where you can write a linear story about it, or at least a story that's easy to follow if you're jumping around.
I
And
think
then go ahead.
one of the things that happened quite early on was, I got my table of what was happening in the events. I start writing the book, and then you go, oh, well, what happened here? There's you've got to get what could have happened, and that led to going and finding out more. And if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have got so much story.
Yeah, I think I like the organizing the letters by date and then by person, and then just seeing how that sits on your mind, and then doing the abstract for each one makes a lot of sense to help you remember it. That's the the learning curve of anything. I mean, you can't just write a book about all these issues without engrossing yourself in them. You'll know more about that stuff than anybody that reads the book will know. And that's just all the way that's whether that's fiction or nonfiction. I think that's the case, is the story is much bigger than contained in a book.
Yes, I'm sure there are lots of people who know much more about the Holocaust than I do, and because it's a really big subject. But yes, I suppose I know quite a lot about a very little area of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you're zoomed in on that. It's part of a much grander picture that I don't know if anybody can ever see the whole picture of it alone. So it's, while it's complicated, it's still a piece of a puzzle that's much larger.
Absolutely.
Have you ever tried writing it with any of those other programs like Scrivener or Google Docs or something else that helps you separate all the ideas? And it's basically like, I see it as one of those notebooks that you're putting together with all your different things. You're doing all that stuff in your mind and with your hands. It just has you doing it on the computer, which I've done it that way before when I've written things, but I do like being able to move stuff around physically rather than on the screen. And I've gone back to Word is what I mainly write in as well. But have you ever tried any of those other programs?
No, but I use Post-it,
Okay.
and I used Wordle. So I shoved the whole manuscript into Wordle, and was quite surprised by what came up. The way, because that would just pick out the words that you used most often. And obviously hostel came up a lot, and girl came up a lot. But sort of foreign and strange and things like that came up. So that was quite interesting. Yes, I do use Post-its. No, I have used Google Docs, and I don't find it incredibly intuitive, but obviously I could do it.
Yeah, it's the learning curve there with anything. So I think you just find the process that you like, and then you keep going with that. Like I would imagine if you wrote another book in the future that had to do with journals and letters, you'd have a system figured out better than most people that are doing it for the first time. It's just that learning curve of it. And
well, I'd probably, in terms of letters, I'd probably try and figure out a better system than the one I used. But I'd probably go and stay with Word, because the more I use it, the better I am.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
I might even not use EndNote, but use the references within Word instead.
it's easy to get lost in writing a bunch of notes about what you're going to write, and then you feel like you've produced a lot, and maybe you have, but you just haven't gotten any farther or any closer to putting words into whatever your final product's going to be. It's more of, you're just creating that bigger story that no one else will ever know. And
But I mean, when it came to notes like that, they're really sketchy. They're handwritten, but they're really, really sketchy. Though sometimes I would get a piece of paper and just write sort of key headlines, if you like, not notes as such. And like a timeline, but maybe a timeline for one series of events for over 10 years or something, not the whole thing.
when you do your speaking engagements, do you go in with a pages of what you've written out of what you want to say, or do you use as you were just talking about the big picture headlines of it, and then just talk about each of those things? Like, do you talk off of a speech or do you talk off of an outline?
Well, actually, I tend to, if possible, I'll use PowerPoint because I've got such nice pictures, and so I just talk off about the pictures. It's very dependent on what people want as well.
Okay.
So the last one I did recently was, or could you do a 20-minute introduction talking about the kinder transport in relation to One Life? And I did it in Kendal, which is next to near Windermere, which is where one of the hostels was. So obviously they wanted to know about how the hostel ran and how it was set up and the girls. Others have been longer and much more linear, where you can tell the whole story from my great grandparents to me getting Austrian citizenship. I don't use notes. I never have. So, but I do rely on the pictures as a prompt. Now that means that if there is no projection or the projection fails, I sometimes take a printout of the slides, but generally I don't, and I hope it won't, and hope it works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine you could just have the printout, and whether other people see it or not, it still helps you to say, okay, now I'm going to talk about this thing.
I've certainly just talked as well at my local library. There's no projection, so I had some of the pictures printed out that we could just pass around, and there I just talked and answered questions.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell the story now without notes because I've done it before.
Yeah. Well, we have your website to look things up and to follow what you're doing, and those will be in the show notes, the website and the other social media links. And then as far as what you have going on next, you're still thinking about?
Yes. I update the website quite regularly, and I'm still thinking about things. And there is a contact form on the website if people have got questions or comments.
Okay, good. And they can also join the Facebook group if they're interested?
Yes, and the people are joining, and that's really interesting. That more sort of generation, the kinder progeny, if you like, are beginning to join.
Nice. Any thoughts about things you wanted to talk about that we didn't talk about, or thoughts for closing?
No, thank you very much for having me. Oh, you can buy the book on Amazon. It's on Kindle. Your bookshop can order it. So,
Okay.
apart from plugging the book, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for your time coming on and explaining all that. I like hearing your process, especially coming from the more technical writing side. And I came from a police background for most of my writing. So it's report writing is different than fiction, but you're still trying to paint that picture, and you're just painting it in a different way, I guess, when you have the ability to do a little more storytelling and connect a few more dots, or things that are going on outside of the necessary story that you need for either your research or for court or whatever. So I like hearing that.
Thank you.
All right, I'll talk to you on the other side of this.